Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me. Mark, thanks for inviting me. As Mark mentioned, this is my first time in Chautauqua, and I'm really struck at the sense of community, the sense of unplugging from the world, learning from each other. And so what I'd like to do today is to really build a sense of community, the sense of co-learning to meet this moment. We are in the middle of a storm, and it's a storm that I'm not sure we all fully appreciate the severity of that storm and its impact on our lives, the impact on everything from the young to the old. So I'm going to walk you through that issue, and of course, I am talking about weather. Were people thinking I was thinking about something else? So before I do that, I'd like to walk you through how I came to this place. I was born in Sri Lanka. My family received one of two immigration lotteries to come to the United States. I'm so grateful for that opportunity. And I only recently realized that opportunity really arose because of the Civil Rights Movement. Like in 1965, the Civil Rights Movement passed a bill to prevent discrimination in immigration. So that directly led to my family's presence in the United States and the opportunity that I have received from all the people that I've met. So during my educational time, I was doing my chemical engineering. Two events fundamentally changed the trajectory of my life and my career. The Civil War broke out in Sri Lanka. At the age of, I think, 18, 19, I was involved in refugee assistance. I was involved in asylum work. I met with Hill staffers to condition U.S. aid based on human rights conditions. And all those times, I kept meeting these pesky lawyers, right? And another event happened. The Bhopal incident happened in India. Bhopal killed 10,000 people, maimed 50,000 people, all an avoidable event. Union Carbide, now Dow Chemical, chose not to have active a pollution control device, and that resulted in those consequences. So I reflected on that moment, and I basically said, I'm going to apply human rights to environmental protection. I went to law school to do so. I practiced law for about 10, 12 years in Manhattan. Manhattan lawyering is not the best thing that I would recommend for folks, you know. So during that time, I threw myself into assisting communities that were burdened by pollution, health disparities. And then I left law firm life, started a not-for-profit to directly assist communities to rebuild their neighborhoods, to identify those circumstances, to really take a proactive approach to their conditions. I was fortunate, based on those experiences, to be asked to join the Obama administration. I was confirmed by the U.S. Senate to be Assistant Administrator at the U.S. EPA. And the thing that I was most grateful for that position is traveling the country, meeting with communities, and trying to solve their problems. Communities that were exposed to contaminants from Superfund sites, communities that were exposed to exposure from chemical plant spills. But one of the most formative experiences is hitting the ground after a tornado rips through a school and the tragedy and death that occurs. I went to Oklahoma City, and so tremendous disaster there. Going to the Gulf Coast, meeting with Vietnamese fishermen whose very livelihoods were at risk due to BP oils and their oil impacts, And so being there at that moment, at that trauma, and trying to just be in the same place with them. But the thing that I reflected at that moment is this spirit of mutual aid that arises in the worst moments of people's lives. How people came together to protect each other, to restore each other. And I'm going to challenge you to all work together in the spirit of mutual aid as we move forward. So I'm going to walk through the impacts of extreme weather. So last year, there were $27 billion incidents in this country. And these are named incidents, or these are named hurricanes. And obviously, as lives lost, property damage, damage to infrastructure. But my view is that there's still a lack of appreciation of investment of how can we protect people from these damages. So during my time at the EPA, I changed the title of my office from emergency response to emergency management. If we wait for the hurricane, it is too late. So we have this moment to work together to protect against those incidents. So heavier downpours. So the intensity of heavier downpours, you see broken up across. So this is like the 1% of days and how the heaviest downpours are increasing. So the problems that we have are not the named hurricane. While the named hurricanes are problematic, it's these regular, intense rain that has regular flooding, and we currently are not investing in protecting people from flooding events. Global temperature. Last year, this week, I'm sure you all have experienced a little bit of heat. Last year was the hottest year on record, which topped the prior year, which is the hottest year on record. Since 2010, we've had the hottest period of time in human history, right? The Gulf of Mexico last year had a temperature of 78 degrees. So these temperatures obviously have some major, major consequences. So cardiovascular illness, premature deaths, aggression. Last year, FEMA recorded the most number of deaths from weather, and it was from heat. The scary part of that is emergency rooms and coroners don't generally list heat as the cause of death. They list cardiovascular, heart attacks, So even that number is an under-recognized number. So heat is particularly acute for older residents, for lower-income residents who may not have cooling, who are also suffering from the twin burden of what's called a high energy burden, a high cost of their salary going to energy. And those who suffer with pre-existing illnesses like asthma. Right? So heat has this compounding effect. And heat is also coincident with increased air pollution at the same time. So you have what's called ground level ozone that occurs at that moment. And we also have increase in particulates that occurs in some part because during these hottest periods, we have to rely on what's called peaking facilities, peaking energy facilities, which are the worst of the worst. They have the least pollution control, and they use bunker fuel. So it's a confounding effect that happen on the hottest days of the year. So we have wildfires. So wildfires are becoming a thing that is regular occurring. So I did an event in Philadelphia, a couple of thousand people, and I asked, Hands to go up. How many people were aware of red flag notices? There were two red flag notices in Philadelphia. Not a single hand went up, right? So why do so many people die in California and Maui? You could talk about a lot of factors, but the extent of death was ineffective warning systems. Ineffective warning systems getting to people, right? And that combined with this mix of drought weather cycles, where you have, in California, you had this short wet weather cycle, grew vegetation, incredible drought, which created this fuel, and then you had land use policies of kind of building where they should not have been. So wildfires are unfortunately here to stay. And those that live here have been exposed to the Canadian fires, right? And most of, like, northern part of the United States have had health impacts by a distant fire, right? So we have this impact from wildfire that is multi-dimensional, and the causes are multi-dimensional. And then you have, what I call the consequence of extreme weather. So I was also responsible for chemical plant safety during the Obama administration. I had all the fun jobs, during the Obama administration. So 1/3 of regulated facilities are in the path of projected hurricane floods and wildfires. 3,000 reported chemical releases due to power loss, but these 3,000 facilities have yet to put in backup power. So insurance. So we're seeing a breakdown of insurance. I promise there'll be some good news at the end. So Hurricane Ida shows 40% of homes were uninsured. Homeowners living in areas with multiple events are showing 82% higher than those in low-risk areas. So Munich reinsurance, so insurance, you have the direct insurance, and then you have reinsurance that covers the back-end risk. So globally last year, Munich reinsurance only covered $108 billion of $320 billion of the claims from weather events. So one of the most striking reports that I've read in the last year was a report by the U.S. Department of Treasury that was issued the first week of January. So somehow we got lost, and some events happened afterwards, but the significance of that report was lost. So we talked about the insurance rates going up. We also have insurance companies pulling out of markets. So both kind of the event-based insurance, like flood insurance, but also basic property insurance. So in Florida and California, we're seeing insurance being pulled out of markets or reducing their coverage. We also are seeing these cascading effects. So in these areas where you have these weather events, we're seeing the land values going below the mortgage price. And so the U.S. Department of Treasury, based on data from insurance companies and data from state insurance agencies, are calling out the real risk of wholesale financial sector failure because of this mortgage-backed security problem. So you have these bad mortgages that are packed into these mortgage-backed securities, and when the underlying asset fails, it causes cascading effects of these financial instruments. So 2008, the failure in 2008 was because of these mortgage-backed securities. So what the Department of Treasury predicts or forecasts is if we don't do something about it, we're going to see wholesale market failure. So we need to work now to address these risks. And by the way, this unit of the Department of Treasury no longer exists. It no longer is collecting data from insurance companies. And FEMA is no longer reporting billion-dollar incidents. It's a question that we have to ask. So this radical group called BlackRock, you've heard about that, right? So BlackRock is forecasting that unless we do something about this gap, this growing gap between damage and coverage, negative GDP by 2060. And this is BlackRock, which probably has access to probably the most rigorous data, financial data. So why does this happen? So I went through the private property insurance problem and the mortgage problem. But we also have municipal infrastructure that is significantly impacted by these events. So again, I want to scare you to then come together to solve the problem a little bit. I don't want to scare you too much, I'm sorry. So we're working with this one community that is the community that's most exposed to flooding. So 93% of the residents, is based on surveys done over a few years, have experienced flooding. Unreimbursed costs, medium unreimbursed costs were $25,000. 50% of the residents were not aware of evacuation plans, of emergency response plans. 90% were not aware of how to evacuate if they need to evacuate. So we decided that we need to build a community to solve this problem. So we brought together insurance companies. We brought together hospital officials and public health officials, local residents, local governments, and asked them, one, are you aware of this risk? And frankly, not everyone was fully aware of this risk. But then we asked the question, how can we work together? What are the gaps? And how can we address those gaps collectively? I'm going to walk you through some of the major findings. So this is a high level, and I'm going to go through some of these in detail. The major findings from, frankly, none of these are rocket science issues, right? But addressing them is really going to take all of us to come together, work with both local governments, work with other community institutions to really address this problem in a consistent, collaborative way. So I'll walk, I talked about the insurance and financial system, so we do need to figure this out around how do we relook at the insurance model. So there's some early thinking about public-private models to deal. If we don't deal with this issue, the entire mortgage industry is at risk. So we need to deal with this issue. So we need to figure out a mechanism where we mix public and private money, and that's been done in some areas, And we also need to have more transparency of the data. So with the federal government getting out of the data collection, we need to figure out a way where we can have a table with insurance companies, financial sector, but also residents and community institutions have a fully transparent conversation. How can we deal with these risks for both insurance and broadly financial instruments? So public health and hospital systems. So I'll just, this is just a snapshot of our report, and if you're interested, I can provide the full report to you. How do we make sure that hospitals have adequate backup energy to withstand an event? How do we make sure that they're properly trained to diagnose heat illness? Right now, there is a major gap in diagnosing especially chronic heat illness that manifests over time. So this is not something that's been a traditional training in the public health field, building up that knowledge and that training. And how do we make sure that the medical personnel can be activated when necessary? So we are working on kind of a right to cooling campaign. In the same way that there's a right of heating obligation in most municipalities, but that doesn't exist during the cooling season. So it's particularly pronounced for low-income residents who may not have cooling, who frankly, who may have challenges paying their bills. How do we make sure that there's a right to cooling, policies and potentially looking at building and zoning regulations? So local governments have been underfunded historically. The last time there were grants for local governments to comprehensive planning around emergencies was 1986. So we need to kind of support resourcing at the municipal level, at the state level, to build up that capacity, but not just in terms of city government, but city government, municipal government, state, convening you all to identify the issues, how we're going to solve those problems together. Now, what I call localizing information, unfortunately, we're at a moment where information is even going to be less available. Even NOAA's data is going to be more and more restricted. So one of the things that we've heard from residents is that at a local level, they don't even know where and how to evacuate, right? They don't even know effective messaging around what are the risks and how can we address those risks. So we need to go beyond kind of the traditional red flag notice. Like, what should you do at that moment? So by hands, how many people in this room have a go bag? So I would say maybe 10%. We should all have a go bag. Unfortunately, we all should need to have a go bag, and we need to know what needs to go into that go bag. We need to protect ourselves, basically from medication, our personal information. In the worst case scenario, you need to know what to do at that moment of crisis. But also, again, I want to go back to, we need to prepare for that worst, but we need to prepare now to prevent the worst harm from these weather events. So inclusion of vulnerable populations. So historically, emergency planning has been this professionalized exercise. And I really appreciate the role of responders, to getting to the event. But we're at a moment where this cuts across all of us. We all need to be at the table. And in particular, we need to make sure the voices of the most vulnerable, the elderly, the handicapped, and their particular issues of transportation, of medicine. We need to really reframe the table to solve this problem together. So community partnerships, the interesting thing, I go back to this mutual aid issue that I've experienced. It is the local community not-for-profits who have really been at the front line in recovering of neighborhoods. But they've not been brought into the process, a planning process. They've not been providing resources to kind of engage their residents. So we really need to institutionalize the role of local not-for-profit community, or whether it's social services or community development corporations. We really need to bring them into the fold and effectively resourcing them to play a role in aspects of preparedness and recovery. So intergovernmental coordination. So the interesting thing is that you may have a notification of a weather event, but the adjacent county may actually not do that same notification, even though the same populations are affected. So we need to have intergovernmental coordination of both the communication and the response. So I mentioned evacuation and planning and awareness. So again, we need to know how to evacuate if we need to do so. So, an effective messaging, I mentioned it earlier, with the appropriate language, but not only appropriate language, in a way that people understand what to do. The land use and infrastructure planning, I mentioned that, like in wildfires, for example, there is a nexus between land use policies that literally provides fuel that exacerbates the wildfire conditions. And flooding, similarly, we need to look at kind of land use policies. So I'm not going to test you on these details. The reason that I went through these areas is I want to kind of convey this is what we heard from stakeholders. All of these may seem like a lot, but at the end of the day, each of these are almost very commonsensical, but we need to work together to address those issues. Here's what we're doing, we're in the beginning of doing is like creating an educational campaign regionally and nationally. I'd like to have you figure out how we can do that together. We need to advance some of the policy recommendations that we've identified. We need to figure out, how do we collect and make data transparent? I think to your question about why we're not collecting data, we need to figure out a way of collecting data, making it transparent so that community institutions, governments, and city and local know what to do from that information. And we need to convene stakeholders. I come from the power of community. I believe at this moment, we need to build community of purpose to lead the identification and the problem solving. And this is where my heart has always been. At the end of the day, I started off with kind of a human rights-based approach to my work. I believe the problems may seem insurmountable, but I really believe in the power of coming together. It's like, I'm not going to get Margaret Mead's quote exactly right, but what she said was exactly right. We can and must solve the problems that I went through. So I will ask you, how can we come together to solve that problem? So I'm going to finish with where I began. I believe in the spirit of mutual aid. I believe there's a real power of coming together to protect each other, coming together to protect the most vulnerable, and then in doing so, we protect all of us. So how can we build local coalitions to advocate and articulate the risk in front of us? Advocate for local and state budgets, advocate for resources for local non-governmental organizations to do what they do best, whether providing social services in this time of crisis, education. We need to enhance the funding of local institutions. And my hope is, by doing so, we kind of rebuild the trust of local community building so we can grapple with some of the more difficult issues. There are going to be no difficult issues. We may not and cannot build in all the same places that we built before. And we cannot build in flood zones. Right now, the rules preventing building in flood zones have been eliminated. Right? Some of the more difficult issues of where we build, infrastructure issue is, and then my hope is that as we build and rebuild and strengthen communities at the local level, communities that are connected nationally, that we begin building that knowledge, building that trust to take on that dirty word called climate change and democracy. So my hope is that as we meet the needs from this extreme weather, protect the communities that are most at risk, build trust, build relationships to address those issues, that we can grapple with these difficult issues. And I believe they are solvable. History shows us that if we come together with intentionality, we can solve the problems in front of us and use that trust building to solve other problems. Obviously to do that is going to take some resourcing that I'd love to have a discussion about, but to advance those issues. So I want to thank you. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for the questions that I'm sure you're going to pose. But I want to really kind of challenge you all to how can we use this moment to build a community of purpose, wherever you live. My vision is that we build kind of this national platform that shares knowledge and practices that really empowers the construction of local communities to solve these problems. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to your questions.